So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our Careers in Climate Action Speaker Series. This is the last one of the semester, and I know this is the last day of classes for Harvard College. So thank you so much for coming out for this talk. My name is Leslie Hubbard. I am the Program Manager for Climate and Sustainability at the Salata Institute. And we are thrilled to have two amazing guests with us from BSR. Business for Social Responsibility. And for those of you who don't know about BSR, it is a nonprofit organization that works with its network of more than 300 member companies and other partners to build a just and sustainable world. And it has offices in Asia, Europe, North America, and BSR develops sustainable business strategies and solutions through consulting, research, and cross-sector collaboration. And we have two BSR employees with us today. I would like to introduce first Beth Richmond. Beth Richmond is the Director of Transformation and helps companies create a more just and sustainable world through cutting-edge sustainability management and strategy. And Beth leads BSR's strategy practice, helping companies understand performance, identify priorities, and design effective sustainability solutions that increase resilience and deliver value for business and society. And prior to joining BSR, Beth served as the Director of Sustainability for a packaging manufacturer, where she was responsible for corporate-wide sustainability strategy and implementation. Beth also worked as a consultant for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she developed benefit cost analysis of proposed federal regulation and supported industry partnership development. And Beth also holds a Master's of Environmental Management from Yale School of the Environment and a BA in Economics from Colby College. And right next to me is Taylor Black. Taylor Black is an associate at BSR focused on working with BSR companies across industry, particularly on climate change, including science-based target alignments and climate scenario analysis. She's also part of the Climate Justice Working Group. And prior to joining BSR, Taylor worked on a variety of research projects and internships covering carbon accounting, biodiversity metrics, and supply chain and human rights. She also worked for Walt Disney Company in China, as well as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, in the Gulf of Mexico. And Taylor holds a Master's of Liberal Arts in Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University, where she focused on sustainable business and environmental policy. And she also holds a BA from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And in the middle, we are joined by our own Salata Institute intern, Chaitanya Gupta, who is almost graduating from the Kennedy School as a Master in Public Policy student, and going into impact investing is his next career move. So thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to the speakers, and I'll turn it over to our moderator now to start the conversation.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you so much, Beth and Taylor, for joining us today. Maybe I'll just kick it off with like a broad question, right? First with you, Beth. Can you describe BSR's overarching mission over and above what Leslie just described?
Sure. I mean, I think Leslie did cover it. We work with business to create a just and sustainable world, and that encompasses a lot. We have a number of teams that work on that from different angles. I sit on our transformation team, which works on sustainability management, which is sort of strategies. How does a company think about integrating all of these kinds of topics into the business? We have a human rights team. We have an equity, inclusion, and justice team that focuses on diversity and social justice generally. We have the climate team where Taylor sits and a nature team, and we work really cross-functionally across a lot of different industries, tech, utilities, mining and energy, as well as consumer sectors and financial services, et cetera. So we're really broad-based. We are a mission-driven organization, though, so I think that sets us apart from other folks who do consulting work. We really see ourselves as that critical friend that can help businesses to be better by translating what is going on with external stakeholders and in the wider world with civil society into language that business can understand and act on, and we can help them to do that.
Thank you for that, and I think that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is about, for both of you, is around how do you think BSR differentiates itself from other sustainability consulting firms? More specifically, like what are some of the most impactful initiatives or projects that you guys have worked on that really you think set BSR apart?
Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just build off of what you said. Like, we really focus on impact a lot. And I think maybe you don't see that in some of the bigger sustainability consulting firms where you're still working at BSR with these really large companies and still getting this really good corporate experience, but you're also really focusing on impact, and they know that going into the projects as well. I also think it's really great at BSR we get the opportunity to work on a decent amount of grant research and collaborative initiatives where we bring together a group of companies. They can be member and non-member companies, and they'll work on an initiative within their industry or maybe some new trend in sustainability or something that they're really falling behind in, or just really want to make progress on that's new. And some of those examples are like, I'm working with a film collaboration now, so we're working on climate storytelling and film with the major companies for that. And then there's also a human rights and AI group at BSR that's very, very ahead of the curve on their research.
Maybe one other differentiator I think to call out here, we are a membership organization, so that sets us up from the start a little bit differently with the companies that we're working with. They have joined BSR because they believe in the mission of the organization, and we really work with them throughout their journey, not just on project work, but as a partner and a consultant. You know, when something comes up where they say, hey, I'm thinking about this, I'm not really sure how to handle it, we are sort of an extension of the team, and we do that through the membership. So there's a lot of kind of continuous interaction and relationship building that happens. And for example, some of the folks that I'm working with in the largest businesses where I'm an account manager, I've worked with for the last 9 years, you know, while I've been at BSR. So we have really strong relationships, really trusted partnerships, and it's not always a sales conversation. You know, it's really a partnership conversation. I think the dynamic is a little bit different than some other organizations that you might find that also do that project-based consulting work.
That makes sense. Thank you. So Beth, I have a question for you about your journey, right? Can you talk us through your journey entering the climate space, particularly BSR, and now in your role as Director of Transformation? Can you talk through what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So I have a background in environment. So my degrees are in economics and environmental policy. So that's where I got my start. I worked at the EPA. I started in corporate sustainability really through my job at the packaging firm, where I was sort of thrown into being the director of sustainability, the first one that the organization had, and so I sort of had to figure out what that meant, which was both exciting and very challenging. So I spent 3 years doing that and then decided that it was time to try something new. And I found myself in New York and with BSR, who everyone had recommended to me as an organization that aligned with the things that I wanted to do, where I could sort of build my career and figure out where in corporate sustainability I wanted to go next. So honestly, when I joined as an associate, which Taylor is now. It was very broad-based, and it was to get exposure to a lot of different businesses, a lot of different kinds of projects. I focused a lot on climate because that was my background, but I also got to work with the human rights team. I got to work a lot on our strategy projects, and it sort of evolved from there. So I work very cross-functionally, I would say now, on things that relate to environment, but also things that relate to people topics and the intersection between those things, and what is sort of a corporate entity-wide strategy that brings everything together into a narrative that makes sense. I like it because I get to talk to a lot of interesting people and senior leaders within organizations and help to facilitate those kind of aha moments that help them to make a change in direction. I think one thing that has been really interesting for me at BSR, and it was a new practice maybe 2 years into when I started, we have something called the Sustainable Futures Lab, and that organization is there to make sure that we're really forward thinking. So it brings a lot of strategic foresight to our work, which is thinking about how trends come together and influence the operating environment of a business going forward, thinking about how we can be visionary and then work back to how we're going to achieve those kind of bold visions. And that sort of led me into this strategy space where I sit today. But it's been a really interesting journey, sort of a jungle gym, and I still dabble in climate when I can, particularly around net zero strategy and some of those bigger questions on how do I move an entire business in a fundamentally different direction.
Got it. Thank you so much. Now, Taylor, you've also had a very interesting journey. You worked at the Walt Disney Company, China. You have worked with FEMA in the Gulf of Mexico. Can you talk us through your journey exploring climate and what led you to finally BSR?
Yeah, sure. So I actually grew up on a small farm in like the Appalachian Mountains, and I think that kind of carried me through of wanting to have something environment themed in my career. So it's kind of been something that's pulled through all of the different positions I've been in. But I also did my Fulbright in Mongolia, and that was in Ulaanbaatar. And I don't know if you guys know about Ulaanbaatar, but it's one of the most heavily like air polluted cities in the world. And living in that type of city where they didn't have a lot of policy around it, they didn't have a lot of public education, I kind of saw a really good opportunity to go into environmental policy, because obviously those are issues we have in the US as well, but it really like inspired me seeing like the direct impacts of climate change on like a hurting community, because you don't really see that necessarily here. It moves a lot slower in this country. So I think just having that experience where you can actually see the real effects of it. And then I went to my grad program at the Fletcher School. And I don't know if any of you are Kennedy students, but it's a very similar program, so we can talk about it in classes if you would really like to later. But I originally went in focusing on environmental policy, and then that kind of morphed into more of like the ESG, sustainability, and metrics side that I do now.
Thank you so much. So now going a little bit deeper into BSR, Beth and Taylor, feel free to jump in as well. Could you talk about like a specific project that you had that you think has been like super impactful?
Yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit in advance, and I will give you two examples that I think are cool. And actually, both of them are climate examples. They're some of my favorite projects. The first is with an energy company, and it's one of the largest energy companies in the US. They do electricity in particular. And we were tasked with doing a climate scenario analysis for them. And it was at the beginning of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the guidance there. So it was one of the first climate scenario analyses that we had done, but also the first ones that kind of were out there. Scenario analysis was not a core part of climate 5 years ago, and so it was an interesting project to get into. What it let us do is involve a lot of senior leadership in the development of a vision for different ways that the future could unfold related to climate. And that's not just physical risk, but it's also how the policies are going to look, how stakeholders are going to respond to your products, how society will adapt to different aspects of climate change. And so we built 3 very specific narratives for around how the future could play out, and used it to help them test how their strategy would hold up. We spent 2 days doing that, and at the end of it, we had fundamental recommendations for not just how sustainability strategies should change, but how the business needed to evolve. And so I think, you know, those moments where you can have that conversation with a CEO that helps them to envision a new world and think about how the business fundamentally needs to change to adapt to that world, and what the sustainability implications are, it's really transformative. I mean, the second example I'll give you is working with a personal protective equipment manufacturer in Asia. A lot of plastics, protective gear for medical applications in particular, on a net zero strategy. So how do you take something that is a single-use personal protective item that is going to be medical waste and burned, and make that compatible with a net zero future? These are really thorny questions and really hard, but I think help them to think about, okay, what is it that we fundamentally deliver? Is it a rubber glove, or is it personal protection? And how can we think about innovating to still deliver that personal protection in a way that works for healthcare workers while also not having our climate impact? Long term, right? So these are not things where you see immediate impact, where you flip a switch and things change, but it is where you get authorization for more investment in innovation towards a particular goal that will have those long-term benefits. So those are my 2. I'm sure Taylor has other ones, though.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm glad you explained climate scenarios, because I'm going to say and branch off of that. I started working on one last fall, and we've actually been revamping the scenarios based on new data that we have, because obviously it updates very, very quickly, and the data sets that we use update every about 1 to 2 years right now. So we were working on a research project to rewrite the narratives and restructure them based on the old ones. And there's actually been a recent project we worked on with a company that is very, very advanced in their ESG program. So we've been able to test out a lot of things with them, and they've been really, really great on just kind of letting us experiment with new stuff. So we've done like a financial risk model and a geospatial model for their assets, and allowed them to see kind of what would be at the most risk from what type of weather impacts, looking at 2100. And then they also did like the regular climate scenarios offering, and went through integrating that with their ERM. So it's kind of been, they got like the whole plate of things, and it's been a really long integrated process, and we had kind of a larger team working on it, which was also really great. So I would say that would be one. And then also, I think I mentioned earlier the film collaboration that I work on. That one's very cool, because we get to work directly with all of the major film companies and kind of see how they are integrating one like climate action into their reporting strategies and their actual operation strategy, and a lot of renewable energy work there as well on sets, but also getting to do that climate storytelling piece and the education piece is very cool to see how you can kind of disseminate the information on a higher scale.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. And just sort of, I think you addressed the next question which I was going to have, which was about scenario analysis. But building off of the first project that you mentioned, right? Could you talk a little bit more about like what are the specific challenges that you face in getting industry to come to terms with sustainability and the way forward that they have to move in, and how do you navigate some of that as consultants?
Yeah, so I think for the most part we try and be evidence-based, right? So everything we do starts with research. It starts with conversations with stakeholders, both internal inside the business about what are the impacts that they're seeing, and then also externally talking to civil society partners, talking to folks who are impacted on the ground, not just for climate, for other things as well. So as I said, we have a human rights practice. We do lots of work on what are the implications of business for people in communities where companies operate. There's research in terms of data-driven research on environment and things like that as well. So it's a combination of sort of building the story with data in a way that is compelling, that sounds easier than it is, because it's lots of really complex topics that then get turned into a 10-slide PowerPoint deck that someone will actually read. So the process to get there is challenging, but really important to like hone the message, right? And to make sure that you've gotten the most salient details while not losing the nuance of what you're saying, and providing all of the research and backup for that discussion. I think then it's really important to have folks interact with what you're saying, right? So one of the reasons I think the futures practice is so powerful is that you have to imagine yourself in a different world, right? It's very narrative. Despite being data-backed, it asks you to say, suspend reality. Imagine that we are in a different place where this is the reality. How does your business react? What are the impacts to stakeholders? And really interact with that world. And that's where I feel like we get an unlock of, if I believe this to be true, then I need to make a fundamental change. And then there's the question of, do I believe this to be true, which goes back to the data, right? So it's a little bit of an iterative process to bring people along. I would say we act as facilitators, right? We are experts, but we also have to act as facilitators to help people along a journey to discover things for themselves and make their own choices. As consultants, you don't have that direct control over what someone will do. You are not the decision maker, you are a recommender, right? And so you have to help people along that journey of self-discovery so that they can make the good decision. And often that means having a diverse set of people in the room who can share that experience together and come to kind of a joint conclusion on what the next steps are. But in practice, there are a lot of dynamics there. There are people dynamics and power dynamics and just logistical dynamics of how you've set up a room and what's coming together. So lots of challenges along the way, but I think really interacting with what you're seeing and feeling and touching is the way I've found most success in having people come to new conclusions and unlock new things that they want to do.
Thank you so much. And I think you talked about a very important thing, right? Like the role of like human rights and a lot of like very consumer focused practices, which brings me to my next question, particularly for you. How do you think about like the role of climate justice in your work in delivering strategies to corporate clients? Like how do you incorporate climate justice?
Yeah, I think it can be one, very tricky, but one like also very easy at the same time, because climate justice is so intertwined with every single topic that we are talking about. So it's very easy to add something in about that. But at the same time, it is not necessarily on the forefront of the company's mind unless maybe it's a company that is very directly impacting things, right? So they're not necessarily thinking about the widespread impacts in their communities or for their employees even, or the use of their products, for example. And we have to think about all of those elements in line with, typically in scenarios projects, but I think any strategy you're thinking about, you have to start tying in all of the elements. I think I made the analogy at work today, actually, that like having 3 meals a day was kind of the same as having your 3 elements of ESG. So you need to make sure that you're having the environment, the social, and the governance, so you have a really balanced diet, and you can't skip out on one because then you'll kind of miss a nutritional piece that you really need in your day. So
that makes sense. Thank you. On that question for you, Beth, is how do you see the interplay between climate change, sustainable business practices, and increasingly environmentally conscious consumers that are evolving and coming up in the next decade?
That is a very hard question, but thank you for asking it. I think we're increasingly seeing a willingness from business to have tough conversations about this. So BSR held a series of events last year called Beyond Growth, where we really looked at kind of the degrowth movement and what that means for business. I think it's hard because business has a particular role to play, and shareholders and other stakeholders like employees that they're accountable to. So it's really a tricky conversation. I think there's the easy piece, the relatively easy piece, which is designing new products and services that are more environmentally friendly, right? There's the maybe slightly harder piece around circularity and how do you develop systems that are more closed loop where recycling is better and materials make it back into the stream. Then there's a really difficult conversation about what is sufficient. What is sufficient for a consumer to be happy and healthy, and what is business's role in defining what is enough for a particular consumer or a particular market. And that, I think, is a thing that we are just starting to have a conversation about. So I definitely don't have a crystal ball on what that will look like going forward. But we've seen some really inspiring action from business, at least on the first 2 components of that discussion, really recognizing that consumers are interested in sustainability and acting to address that interest and develop products that meet those needs, and then really investing in circularity, in resource conservation, in the systemic challenges that come with that. I mean, if you look at recycling infrastructure in the US and how hard it is to get plastic from a consumer back into the system, those are really hard challenges, and we've seen tremendous investment in that space. So I think, we're moving in the right direction. There's still some really tough conversations that we need to have. Lots of willingness to have those conversations, particularly in Europe. I think we're having a lot of those of interest from business there in particular. But also, we held these events globally and we had good conversation with business sort of across the board.
Mm-hmm. I think a good thing to add to that too is a lot of the companies that I work with, they end up using like COVID as an example of how consumer impacts can happen and how they may like change direction very quickly. In my work, like climate disasters ramp up really quickly, or the way that we switch to remote work so rapidly. So with all of the things that happened during COVID, I think that it was one thing that they can use as a case study and see how it did impact their business. And a lot of them do use that.
That makes sense. I think the COVID example is super relevant. So just shifting tracks a little bit, talking about like how students can get involved with the space. I think the first question for both of you is, what are the kinds of skills and knowledge that you think are essential for people who want to enter the space of sustainability consulting? Are there specific certifications, programs, or any other tangible steps that students can take to position themselves better for roles at companies like BSR?
Okay, I go first if that's okay. So there's certainly a suite of soft skills, and I think I talked about some of them already. You know, communication is really important, facilitation is really important, even, you know, PowerPoint and graphic design is really important because that's how we convey a lot of our messages. So there's a lot of those kinds of influence without authority skills that are important, change management's important, all of those things I think are important in sustainability generally, whether or not you go into consulting. And then I think right in this moment, we're at a place of moving from voluntary action to mandatory action. So there's a ton of regulation that is coming out in terms of mandatory sustainability reporting in Europe and other places globally. And also mandatory due diligence, which means, you know, risk-based approaches to understanding your impacts and addressing them in a proactive way and then talking about them. But with compliance comes a lot of complexity. And so businesses right now are figuring out what good looks like and what they're going to do in order to comply with those regulations. If you go into the field in this moment, it's incredibly important to understand what those look like and be well-versed in sort of the voluntary standards that they're based on, as well as the regulatory requirements, and be able to speak to that.
Yeah, I think I would also add to that, because I know we're saying soft skills here too, and I was going to definitely say hard skills. So I think a lot of the work that I end up actually doing is I work in a lot of Excel sheets, I work in GIS, I work in Python. So I think having those skills, at least on a basic level when you go into your company, and understanding how to really work with data is really beneficial right now, especially in the climate space, where we're having to start measuring everything, and you have to be able to, if you get data from a company on their carbon emissions and everything's kind of scattered, which is usually a little bit of what it looks like, you need to know how to piece that together to fit your model and fit your needs for your project, and that's super important. But I also think having a good standard knowledge of, like what you were saying with policy. I was going to say climate policy is like good to take that class, but definitely take environmental law like broadly and really understand how all of those systems work on an international level, because you will encounter like these new regulations that directly impact wherever you're working and all of your colleagues as well.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. For people in the room, do you have any advice for them as they look to make careers in the space?
You want to go first?
Sure. I think my biggest advice here is, especially if you've worked before, or maybe you started with a different major or something like that, there will be a space for you to apply that somewhere in sustainability, and we need people from all different backgrounds. Maybe if you work in communications, maybe if you worked before in like another consulting firm, you like still will be able to use that in industry. You'll still be able to use that in a consulting firm or a different type of sustainability program. So any knowledge or experience that you have up until this point is going to be useful somewhere, and you need to have as many like varied skills as possible to kind of bring to the table, because we need all of the people to be on hand.
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of advice is not to expect a playbook. You know, a lot of these things are new and we have to figure them out. And so sometimes we have folks come in who really just want us to say, you know, this is how you do it, go run and do this thing. And I think that doesn't exist for much of this work. And so just being prepared and open to taking a problem with no solution and using your best judgment to figure out how you should approach it is really important. I think the other thing is just not to take things personally, right? There's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of emotion around a lot of these topics, and you'll be in rooms where there are a lot of thought discussions. And I think it's really important to be able to look for and listen to what the person is really saying and where they're coming from and what the challenges are, and to try kind of to take that on board. I think it's incredibly important in the work we do, but I think it's also really emotionally taxing. And so to be in a headspace where you know it's not you and you're going to move past what it is and move forward, I think is really important if you take this career path generally, just for your own kind of health and well-being.
That makes sense. I think looking forward, what do you think are the next big challenges that sustainability consultants need to prepare for? I'm thinking of like tech. How do you think about like how tech and like AI and stuff is changing how consultants work with clients, but also like how does engineering work?
Yeah, I mean, I can build off that example in particular. So I think increasingly tech is replacing and AI is replacing some of the baseline research that we used to have folks doing, right? So you have AI that will help you scan PowerPoint documents and will help you scan PDFs and will collate things from across the internet. And so some of that initial analysis is happening. We need to approach it with skepticism because often it's wrong. So finding the right balance in how you use those tools, I think, is really important. But there is a shift towards more software-driven solutions, more big data-driven solutions, and so figuring out how we complement that, which I think we can, is really important. I think the other thing tech is doing is bringing in new challenges, right? So if we think about tech-driven solutions to some sustainability challenges, let's take, for example, extreme heat in agriculture. You could approach employee protection by replacing those employees with tech-driven solutions. Or you could embark in monitoring devices that employees wear so that you can tell if they're exposed to extreme heat and need a break. Those things bring their own challenges, and so I think we're going to continue to discover new challenges to work on, even as we're solving the existing challenges of today. So I think that, kind of goes back to there is no playbook. We will continually discover new things that we need to work on as we do this work and solve some of the challenges that we face currently. And so just being open to that and sort of thinking a couple years in advance, I think is going to be really important.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the AI piece is also, it's very vague, and we talked about climate justice a bit already, so I'll talk about biodiversity and nature, because working on the climate team, I see a lot of integration between the two, and climate's kind of your base step, right? You're counting your emissions and you're worried about that direct impact of those emissions, but when you branch off into biodiversity, you start looking more at your scope 3 operations. You look at how water's impacted, land's impacted. There's a lot of measurement. There's a lot of location-specific data and information you really have to look at there. So that's a really complex problem that we're just now starting to tackle, trying to value ecosystems and really maintain that. It's also a very serious issue too, and we're just now starting to really talk about it and develop teams for it separately.
Can I add one other thing here? Because I think we went down the tech road, but I think there are some other things that are going on in the space. So one thing I will just also add is as we see more regulation, as we see more mandatory sustainability action, we're seeing many more people within a business needing to be involved in that decision making and involved in the execution of the work. And there's a tremendous amount of upskilling that needs to happen, both of those new professionals being involved in the work and sustainability topics, but also sustainability professionals on how to work in different functions within the business. And that is challenging for a number of reasons, right? And so in the next maybe 5 years, we're seeing a lot more cross-functional work that needs to be navigated and just a lot more of that collaboration, and I think it's going to take a while to shake out. So one of the challenges I would expect to face going in is sort of who is in charge of this thing, where does the budget go, just very practical considerations in an inflationary environment that we're going to need to be navigating as we think about corporate sustainability in particular.
Got it. last question for me, and then we can open it up to the audience. How do you define success in the profession that you have, or a project, or at a firm level?
So I think we have impact in every single conversation we have with a senior leader in a business. I'm just going to say that now. I think, every interview is an opportunity for impact, for broadening somebody's perspective, and for our own learning on what will create a solution that's going to work practically within a particular organization. In terms of project success, my metric is, did something change in a positive way? Right, which is very basic, but I think is what we're after. We don't always wind up in the place we thought we would at the beginning of an engagement, because we're planning a project based on limited information and a hypothesis, right? So we don't always land in the same place. But if we can look back and say something changed fundamentally, ideally in someone's business strategy, not just your sustainability function, but like how you do your work, that is my measure of success.
Yeah, I think for me, it's about meeting the company where they are in their sustainability journey. So with the project I was telling you about earlier with the climate scenarios, we had the very advanced team, and we were able to use a lot of more complex data and new methods for giving them answers that they were looking for. But maybe the company I'm working with now is a little more nascent, and they're in an entirely different industry, so they don't have the same needs. And maybe they want us to entirely redesign parts of our projects or leave parts out to kind of meet their professionals a little bit closer to home and a little bit more where they can understand what's going on and actually interpret the message. And I think that makes it kind of built off what Beth was saying, though, it makes it a lot more usable for the company, and it makes it a lot easier for them to grasp the concepts. So yeah, I guess meeting them where they are is really it.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. That was super insightful. I'm going to open it up for audience questions. If anyone wants to ask anything, just raise your hand. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for the panel. One question is on aggregate confusion that I've been hearing a lot, because there's different scoring criteria as well as standards these days for ESG. What does it mean by bettering for the environment or giving risk to the environment, as well as how to define wellness, etc. So you have different companies that came up with a different ESG score for the same company. So just wondering, from the broader standpoint, looking into ESG consulting in general and scoring in general, what's your thought in terms of the effectiveness of using these ESG score to guide company as well as investors or other people that are looking into the company's behavior?
So do you mean like in terms of raters and rankers and scoring of companies on different...
Yeah. And how that actually makes an impact, or if it's the score that matters, or is it really, the work that's behind, as you're saying, every interview makes an impact, and the conversation and the action that produces out of it?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab and then welcome Taylor as well. I think the score matters in that there are a lot of situations where you can't look at a nuanced level, and so the score gives you a good sense of what in aggregate, on average, things look like. I think it's incredibly important that those scores are transparent, because as you say, they are all evaluated differently. So if you cannot unpack what goes into the score, then it's less meaningful. So I do think that work is helpful, and a lot of the agencies who are doing the scoring have really complex ways that they are thinking about how they've come up with that score, and that work is useful. But it's not enough, right? So the nuance of every situation really matters, and a lot of, particularly kind of the big data solutions, the data environment, the data lake they're working off of is really imperfect. And so a lot of the way that scoring happens is also imperfect, and so if you don't understand sort of underlying what's going on, I think it's less valuable. But like if you're looking across an industry and want a sense of what a business is doing, then I think those scores are really useful, and they're getting increasingly sophisticated, right? And they're getting more regulated, right? There's guidance in the EU and additional attention to what raters and rankers score and what it looks like. but it's not going to tell you the whole story, and it's not necessarily going to predict what business performance is going to look like, right? There's a lot of additional nuance that's necessary to really understand what's happening. But I don't want to say it's not a useful effort, because I think it is to understand in aggregate what the picture looks like. I just don't know that it's sufficient at this moment in time.
Yeah, I think I was going to really hit on it's great for industry benchmarking maybe, and comparing companies that are kind of similar to each other and where they are. And maybe it's not as useful outside of that particular view, because if you're comparing companies from different industries on the same standard, that maybe that's not a fair analysis. And then what you were saying about the imperfect data, these are very complicated models sometimes, and some of the data points behind them are a little obscure. And so I think just keeping that in mind and making sure that you're looking at where it's coming from, like Beth said.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I was kind of curious about the emphasis, how much emphasis is placed on like the financial feasibility of some of the solutions that you propose. Because I imagine if you're working with for-profit entities, I think a lot of the time, sometimes the excuse is, well, we could do that. That would be like a lot more sustainable and better for the environment, but it would be a breach of our fiduciary duty to our shareholders. So just from your guys' perspective, how much of an emphasis is placed on like the financial feasibility, and then also in your clients' acceptance of the recommendations or implementation of them?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a financial element to both sides. There's a financial risk associated with not acting as well, and so I feel like it's really important to present both sides, and a lot of the frameworks that we're set up to work with do that. So if you look at an exercise like a materiality assessment, which is pretty common practice for business, one of the axes is what is the impact on business success of this topic, both risks and opportunities. So I think that's an important place to start before even having the conversation about financial feasibility of whatever the solution is. I'm not going to say it's not a factor. It absolutely is, right? Availability of capital to do these things is a really fundamental concern, and it's required, right? But we like to think about what we want to do and then think about how to finance it, and we've found that is helpful, right? What is the vision? What do we want to do? And then think about how do we achieve it. And we've seen innovation in the space, over the last 10 years, and how internal teams will finance things through, carbon funds and things like that kind of charge back for impact or perceived impact or risk, and then use those funds to finance projects that will address it. So there's definitely creative solutions. But it's all a question of budget in some respect, and so we just need to be prepared for those questions. There's some interesting work called the Return on Sustainability Investment out of NYU Stern, that is really aimed at just this, making sure that we are fairly understanding the return on investment of some of these more tangible things that we might do in terms of employee engagement and things like that. So they're doing a lot of research on that. And I think that kind of research is really helping to alleviate some of the concern also.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could also add in to that financial piece, it's also a systems issue within some companies. So if you're talking to, you've worked with a packaging company before, and I've done a project with a packaging company at BSR, that's fundamentally a company that is putting out products that are not sustainable, and you have to change the entire company model, and that's not necessarily feasible at the time. So thinking about the financial impact of just changing the entire system, you kind of have to meet them where they are and make the changes to that system that they can make at that time, and then push towards that broader change later. So kind of baby steps.
That makes sense. Any other questions? Yeah.
What is the kind of day-to-day breakdown of your work look like? Do you spend a lot of time doing the research or making implementation, or do you spend more time talking to clients?
Depends on the role. Why don't you go first and then I can go?
So every single day I work is incredibly different, I would say. I spend maybe Out of 8 hours, I'll say I spend probably 2 to 3 hours in meetings, and those can be internal or external. This is average too, some days are 8, so keep that in mind. And then I will work on PowerPoints a decent amount, but it's usually integrated with research as well. So I usually spend about 20 to 30% of my time on research, but that's because I am staffed to a grant to do research. If you're staffed just to projects, you would probably be working on project work more often. I think in a manager role, you would also be doing like more business development and things like that too. I do some of that as well right now, but it's to a lesser extent. And then we also have content development on one part of that too. And that's probably maybe like 10% of my week.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on the role, right? So the associate role is very focused on project research execution, things like that. So a lot of the work is research, it's interviews, it's developing the work product that will be delivered to a business, as well as the piece on like meetings and collaboration with across BSR and across the teams, and check-in meetings with clients and things like that. As you get into a manager role, it's more around project management. So coordinating the work between the associate, and usually there's a project director, sort of keeping everything on track, and then overseeing the initial deliverables and what's going on. When you get into a director role, it's more oversight focused, and so a bit more dispersed in terms of split between project execution and business development and member engagement and things like that. I would say my role is largely focused on business development, which is lots of meetings and proposal development and things like that. Member service and engagement, so having conversations with members about the challenges that they're facing and advice and things like that. And then in project execution, a lot of it's around facilitation. So facilitation of workshops, facilitation of interviews, facilitation of conversations with senior leaders in particular. So we talk a lot with boards, and we talk a lot with kind of senior level staff. And it's a bit more fragmented in terms of the project. So I would say in the associate role, you get a couple of projects and you really focus in on those. As you get more senior, you get more diverse, sort of jumping from thing to thing throughout the course of the day. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Just building on that question, what are the most desired skills or knowledge, background that that's required?
We have an incredibly diverse staff, is what I will say. We have folks from engineering, we have folks from legal backgrounds, I have an economist background, scientific backgrounds, working with people, working on the environment, working from communications, kind of all over the map. I think that's part of the magic of BSR, honestly. We have an incredible team, and we don't have like a traditional background, right? So it's really about what you bring to the table in the role and how you complement everybody else's skill sets. I think some of those soft skills that I mentioned earlier, like there is a consulting skill set. I think that's important, and that's research and analytics and being able to convey complex ideas in simple terms, being able to facilitate conversations and present, and all those things are important. But in terms of like your academic background and experience, there's a very wide range that is desirable, I would say.
There's one question.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things that makes BSR unique is the member aspect, and I would love to hear a little bit more about how that member aspect affects your relationships with the companies you interact with in those partnerships.
You want to take that one first? Do you want me to?
Sure. I think that I have a really good example right now too. So I'm actually working as a point of contact for one company, and I'm working on 2 projects with them at the same time. So I'm speaking with people from that company every single day and interviewing people all across the company on a variety of aspects. And I think that level of knowledge about how they actually work and how the different people relate to one another and are thinking is something you only get from that membership interaction, where you're working with them on those multiple levels all at the same time and across the time period. Like you said, you've had some companies for the entirety of your time at BSR. So It's just really relationship building, and it's more continuity than like a normal consulting firm would be, where you have a project for 2 weeks and you kind of work on that one project for 2 weeks, it's over, and you kind of hand it off. And we get to see it through a little bit more than I think more of a traditional consulting firm would.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think not just the membership model, but the collaboration model also is really important. We interact with companies in a slightly different way and sort of build that trust. We also don't go away. So if we have a strategy project and we've recommended something and it takes a year for somebody to finally get it through their management team and now they're ready to act, we are still there, right? We're still collaborating. I think the other thing is, if we found a really complex problem that is not unique to one company, we have the ability to convene a larger group to talk about it, right? So part of the membership model is that we're fostering peer-to-peer interaction and letting the members learn from each other. And one of the ways that we identify those opportunities is through the project work. So we can build a collaboration. If there are, a bunch of production companies who are saying we're really struggling with how to implement our climate commitments, then we can say, hey, actually, maybe it would be great for you all to meet and talk about this, and maybe there's a collaboration that comes out of this. So it gives us some flexibility in how we meet companies where they are, that isn't tied to a specific consulting engagement, that I think is really powerful.
And another cool thing to add to the collaboration piece is we also invite non-members into the collaboration, so it kind of gives them a taste of that early working with BSR and the option to kind of extend into more consulting engagements after that. That's a more welcoming, kind of like broad space.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Kind of to piggyback off of that question, kind of mentioned earlier about how consultants are really like facilitators and not decision makers, and yet BSR is also an impact-driven group. So how do you strike that balance between wanting to have that impact while also like staying in that like consultant role?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean we don't have opinions about how the world should look, and I think there are global goals that we can tie ourselves to. So we believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are the right direction, and therefore we want to help companies move in that direction. And we can recommend, certainly, right? So we can take all the information that we have taken in and say, based on what we know, this is the direction we think you should head. I think the limitation of consulting is that we can't write the check, right? We can't say, actually, this is the direction you will head, but it doesn't mean we can't have strong opinions and I think one of the powerful things about being a nonprofit and having that expectation that we are an impact-focused organization is that we can challenge. And one of our roles is to challenge. And I think Taylor said it at the beginning that when folks decide to work with us, they're working with us because they know we have that perspective. And so sometimes we're thinking about this strategy, put your NGO hat on and tell us where it's weak, right? And we get that sort of interaction. So I don't want to say we can't influence, and we do, and we put out lots of thought leadership and opinions on how things should head and what the challenges are for business and how business needs to behave differently. So we do all of that. I guess what I would say is just you have to be prepared to not actually be the one sitting in the chair that makes the decision, that writes the check, that moves the thing forward. And that's what you get when you're in a business and in that role of actually making the decisions.
Any other questions? I guess not. Well, thank you so much for all your time and all of you for coming. I think we have dinner ready, and feel free to, I assume you guys are sticking around for a bit.
We are, yeah.
So please feel free to come up and ask questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.